Hello, this is the AI Lab. Today it's my pleasure to welcome Anna Tumadóttir. Anna is the CEO of Creative Commons, an international non-profit organization that empowers people to grow and sustain the thriving commons of shared knowledge and culture. The reason? An article entitled Questions for Consideration on AI and the Commons. Let's hear what Anna has to say. So, Anna, Creative Commons has been conducting a series of exchanges with its global community around AI. What's your take on how the conversation around creator consent and AI has evolved in the past few years? And what are some of the key insights you've gained from your roundtables and workshops on this topic?
Thank you. Yes, and it's a good question. I think it actually makes sense to start by zooming back further than even just the last couple of years and thinking about the origins of Creative Commons, because that sort of informed how we have approached this. Because when the organization was founded over 20 years ago, sharing on the internet was broken. And then the CC licenses were introduced and the commons flourished. And all of this was just because the default under the law was all rights reserved. So there you had a situation where licenses that enabled open sharing were very aligned with the ideals of giving creators choice over how their works were used. And so you had this movement in harmony. And as a result of these, years of stewarding these licenses, we know that people who embrace openly sharing their work have a lot of different motivations for doing so. And as we learned during these roundtables and just through general community response, when AI became mainstream, most folks could not have anticipated how their works would one day be used by machines for a variety of different uses. And so some of these uses might be aligned with what the creator's original intention of sharing was, but some of these uses might not be aligned. And so then when we think about these roundtables, we wanted to determine where's the right place for CC to intervene in this new world of digital sharing. And we figured, let's hear directly from the people who power the commons and systematically trying to connect with creators and legal and policy experts, other general open advocates to talk about these questions. It's very hard to distill this down because we've talked to so many different types of stakeholders in this ecosystem. But I'll highlight just a few of the findings that are driving our current work forward, informed by what we've heard through this community consultation. The most important probably being the individuals, they want more choice over how their work is used. And they look to CC, at least a cohort of them looks to CC because they see us as the organization of creator choice. For another whole cohort, we are the organization of open access. And so that is a little bit of a tension we've been navigating. But anyway, individuals, they want more choice over how their work is used. And largely this is about a desire to indicate some kind of preference or communicate some kind of value with regards to this. But what we also heard is if they don't have a choice, they might limit access to their works in ways that they don't currently do. For instance, someone who would have previously published something on a website for everyone to be able to access might now put it behind a paywall or might simply not publish it at all. A third thing that we heard is that the EU AI Act, while certainly a leading legislation in the area, the choice to opt out is a blunt instrument. And so it really is it's just a no. It's not even a yes or no. It's just a no. And so this doesn't reflect the more nuanced interests that creators tend to have when it comes to this. So for instance, we've heard from a lot of folks that maybe they object to large companies using their works for AI training, but conversely, they might be completely fine with nonprofits and researchers or other public interest minded uses. Finally, of the things that we've heard, there is widespread support for some kind of tool or framework. And at CC, we've been referring to this as preference signals, i.e. the method by which someone could signal their preference with regards to how their work is used. And this could work for rights holders or institutions or even intermediary entities in order to signal how content should be used in AI models. But reflecting on this very wide range of views, we think it's really important that we try to bring a little bit more nuance into how the ecosystem works. And so our thinking as of today, the caveat here is we're still very much in the research phase, is that we're going to focus on trying to build preference signals that go beyond this blunt mechanism of opt-out. But defining exactly what that looks like is going to be our priority in the coming year, probably beyond.
Thank you. That's a helpful response, and it's good to know that so many people were involved and so many different stakeholders. Now, you mentioned in your answer the perceived tension between openness and creator choice. Could you share examples of how this tension has played out in real-world scenarios and what lessons can be learned from them?
Yes, so a lot of what we've heard here has been anecdotal, meaning that it's in these conversations where folks say, "I'm now choosing to do things a different way." But we're hearing also from groups, predominantly in the open access space, that this may be impacting some of the thinking about how they are approaching the sharing of science and research, which is deeply troubling to us. That there may be a shift there. So, for instance, if we look at that lens, scientists and researchers will generally do their work wanting to be read as widely as possible, referenced as widely as possible, and to serve broad public benefits. And so in that ecosystem, they'll make their publications open access, their data publicly available, often under CC0, so that everything can be recreated and reused. And the idea here is maximum, like I said, maximum benefit redistribution, etc. But now we've seen that commercial AI providers making use of scholarly works to train their models is giving some of those in the open access community pause. And so rather than sharing openly, they may consider going the paywall route or using other technical measures to impede broad access. And the worst possible outcome here is that they might even decide to not facilitate reuse explicitly through a CC license. And because of this, it's evident that if people don't feel like they have choices tailored to their preferences, we are probably going to end up with less openness. This is one of the driving factors for why we think an intervention is necessary. We've also heard, again, anecdotes from folks working just sort of broadly in the creative industries that echo this. So individual creators who may have previously CC licensed their works for everybody to use have indicated maybe they will retain full copyright now because they think the CC license exposes them to AI training, which is a misnomer. Or they just might not publish their works in accessible ways at all. There's another interesting tension that's come up here. And again, these are generalizations, but there's a perception among some in the open source AI developer community that anything that's CC licensed is inherently both safe, I say quote unquote, safe to reuse, but coupled with that is this assumption that the original creators would be fine with this use. And so like I talked about earlier, this isn't necessarily the case. People's motivations for sharing something openly 10, 15 years ago would probably look pretty different today if they knew what might happen with their materials. And it is concerning to us because obviously people in the open movement, they've worked tirelessly for 2-3 decades and have made a lot of progress in increasing open content. But this has all been driven by active choice to share. And so if we want to keep making progress, we need to think about this diverse range of preferences. So like I mentioned with the EU AI Act, people can opt out from text and data mining generally, and there are efforts going to provide that function in a clean, machine-readable way. But then we ask ourselves, okay, if the only choice you have is to say no, like what about some of the uses that people would be okay permitting, and what kind of a language or structure would allow us to communicate that? Because obviously, if you just have this blanket opt-out, it doesn't necessarily serve those people well, and we think ultimately it will lead to a smaller commons of knowledge and information that's being shared. So So yeah, one of the ways we're thinking of overcoming this, at least as we try to better understand this effect of generative AI on the broader commons, is some kind of mechanism by which creators can indicate no, unless, and that would be positive for the commons. So sort of like the smallest no for the biggest yes, I think it's how we say it. Plus, this would better align with opportunities that arise from AI, because we want to see a world where science and education and culture are equitably shared. And we want this to serve the public interest, which is ultimately our mission at Creative Commons. But we definitely think there's a lot at risk here right now with the current structures.
Thank you. That is a tension that's going to be important to resolve if you want to keep the commons thriving.
Yeah.
What I liked about your article is that you also looked more specifically at marginalized or underrepresented communities. And as generative AI continues to grow, how can we ensure that those marginalized or underrepresented communities maintain agency over their contributions to the commons, especially in those regions that may have fewer resources?
So this is a really difficult one, and it's so I'll back up a bit. Sometimes when it comes to discussions around openness, and this is pre-AI, people will say, oh, open content or open educational resources or open access to science, like this is going to change everything. And what we need to remember is, sure, that can have really positive impact, but what about someone who doesn't have a computer? What about someone who doesn't have internet? What about someone who doesn't have electricity? Like, the openness of their educational resources or their scientific materials is the least of their concerns. And I think we see this exponentially more when it comes to generative AI, just because of the sheer infrastructure that is required to train these foundation models. So even though it's fairly clear, I think, that generative AI is here to stay, and we want to do what we can to make sure that it benefits the public interest, there are regions that right now have other basic infrastructure considerations that are much greater before they would be able to possibly capitalize on this new technology. And so that means there's a really lopsided development happening. Your regions like the US or the EU, where they're really well equipped and they can put massive investment into compute infrastructure. And then you have other regions where, half of the folks aren't connected to the internet, or half of the folks don't have electricity at home, whatever the case may be, so that it's just a much different equation. This also speaks to the fact that, like, even in a world where everybody had the same level of access to internet and electricity and so on, which I can't imagine we'll ever get to, but even if we had that, you still would not have a one size fits all for technology because of local context and different needs and so on. So if you're thinking about training data, for instance, on the one hand, there's the argument that, oh, we need to include this huge diversity of information because it will help the outputs be much more representative, and therefore access to this wide array of data for training can help mitigate challenges of bias, for instance. But on the other hand, the benefits of these tools have to be broadly shared. And so if there is this lopsided benefit happening, it makes sense to think really carefully about who has access to what and for what purposes, et cetera. Because current market and legal structures do not ensure that there is broad and equitable sharing of these benefits. So I talked a little bit about our ideas around preference signals. That's just one potential tool that might allow, as we develop it, might allow marginalized or underrepresented communities to have some say in how their materials are being used in generative AI models. But again, not dissimilar to the Creative Commons license suite, like it's just one element. It doesn't really necessarily speak to broader governance or broader sort of societal implications or community norms or policies. In addition to this, these are tools that put the onus on the individual, and so that's also not necessarily the right approach here. For instance, when you think about public AI infrastructures and investment in those, there are some things that, like, we, the individuals, can only control so much, but it needs to come from government or those in power. And when I say investment in these infrastructures, not just like, hey, here's this compute power and now we can all train these models together, but really investment in language preservation, digitization of archives, thinking about who gets to train on those for what purposes, etc. So we think it makes sense to keep an open mind. We don't want to rush to intervene necessarily, and think about the development of novel frameworks, and these could be legal or they could be social, that would balance the interests of these impacted communities with the development of a potentially beneficial technology. So, for instance, while we generally believe there should always be an exception for text and data mining for scientific or research purposes, we think that superior to that, traditional knowledge should be exempt from this. And that means that anyone who stewards the traditional knowledge of those communities, they should be able to either explicitly give or explicitly revoke permissions to use any materials they hold for training purposes. So as this assortment of communities that makes up the open movement, we think we really should intervene to make sure that laws and policies that ultimately govern the broader AI ecosystem are done so for the public good, but with a healthy amount of nuance and consideration of some of these matters. And ultimately, ideally, we would get to a place where there's sustainable public AI infrastructure and governance, so that you can have this diversity in regional perspectives and sort of some level of maintenance of agency over contributions of these communities to the underlying development of this. And then finally, we talk about problems in outputs, and often the focus is so much on things like, oh, it's biased, and oh, it's racist. And we also need to remember that it can just be totally factually incorrect. Like, of our litany of problems, like, the list is really long. And so another component that we think about here is you don't want just like factual misrepresentation of a knowledge, of cultural conditions, etc. And so again, it's so important that whenever these models are being developed, ideally we shift to sort of smaller, more nuanced models, that those be vetted, tested, used by, possibly even gated for these communities from where they come. But from our perspective, as we think about developing some kind of tool, obviously the CC licenses are used globally and they are a global standard. The thing that a lot of folks maybe forget today is that the first version of the licenses came out in 2002, and this final stable version that we're currently on, 4.0, came out in 2014. So there were 12 years of iterative development going from, oh, it works in this context or in this country or this legal framework, to, hey, everyone can basically use this globally, and here's sort of, some step downs from that. And so when it comes to intervening in the AI ecosystem and trying to make it more participatory, more values aligned, more public interest focused, with, like I said, these caveats for things like traditional knowledge, like, it's not an easy task by any measure. We also don't think it can be a rushed task, because we don't quite know how these technologies are going to develop. And so the number one thing here is just going to be ensuring that as many voices as possible are heard as we think about, how to intervene, so that the world of open content and just the world of content generally used for AI training is more representative.
Thank you, Anna. I'm going to just keep 3 keywords from your responses, which is nuance, keeping an open mind and not rushing. And I'll hope that policymakers and everyone involved in shaping the framework in which AI will evolve will listen to those words and apply them, because I think those are 3 important things to try to bring to the debate and to keep into this debate. And thank you to Creative Commons for attempting to do so.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for having us.